My name's Andy Parks. I'm the Executive Director of the Vintage Aero Flying Museum, home of the LaFayette Foundation. And I'll explain to you my theory of how Richthofen was shot down and killed. Richthofen was chasing Wap May low over the lines on April 21st, 1918, when he was so engrossed in the combat and wanting to shoot May down, he got himself in a little bit of trouble. Too low to the ground, where he was vulnerable to enemy ground fire, and concentrating only on Wap May and shooting him down. Many people believe that Roy Brown shot him down. However, Roy Brown, who was with 209 Squadron at the time, saw Richthofen going after May, went and fired short bursts at about 1,000+ yards at Richthofen and broke off. At that time, Richthofen continued to follow May until he passed the gunners, Australian gunners, Bowie and Popkin. Bowie being on his left, Popkin being on his right. At some point, when he passes Bowie and Popkin, his plane was damaged. He's still going after May. His plane gets damaged by ground fire. He turns off the engine. He realizes somewhere in there, he saw that if he were to continue to fly straight forward, he'd end up in a forest, same off to his left, but he knew that there was an open field to his right, behind him. So he turned the plane around, approached the field, and made a dead stick landing. When he landed, the gear wire bracing broke, which swung the gear up, spinning the plane around 180 degrees so that it pointed the opposite direction of where he landed. He was now perpendicular across from the brick factory, clay brick factory that was on the far side of the field where the Australian ground troops were. Witnesses said they saw Richthofen stand up in the cockpit and fall down back into the cockpit. Now, had Richthofen been shot in the air, he would have had to fly his plane for about 90 seconds or a minute and a half, turn it around, shut the engine down, and make a very good forced landing with a wound that entered below his right armpit, struck his spine, and came out his heart. Immediately killing him, even if he had a second or two to survive. I don't believe as a pilot he could have controlled a Fokker-Dr-I-Plane in such a manner to turn it around, land it, successfully land it, and then die on the scene of the landing. My belief is, especially if you're a pilot and recognize that he was sitting in the cockpit of the triplane, hand on the stick, arm bent at a 45-degree angle holding the stick, his arm would have covered his armpit. The wound would have had to go through his leather flying jacket, arm, then into the armpit, hit the spine, out the heart. The jacket did not show this type of entry, his flying jacket, nor did his tunic. There was only the wound under his arm. Now, when you go to get out of a Fokker-Dr-I-Plane, you have to reach the struts in front of the wing, the cabane struts, pull yourself up and out, which he was doing, exposing his armpit right here, like this. When he was doing this, he was on the ground, the gunners on the ground, or the army on the ground at the clay factory had the opportunity, one of those guys, to shoot him, which doesn't surprise me. He had just been trying to shoot down their pilot. It was in a ground battle going on, and Richthofen was the enemy. Even though he was an unarmed enemy at the time, I could see an overly excited person in combat taking the shot. It was there that Richthofen was shot and mortally wounded, falling back into the seat of the cockpit. The plane itself had only one bullet hole in it, and that was at the cockpit, and then at the end, did not have a bullet hole in the cockpit, but had it up towards the front where the engine was damaged. I believe there was a bullet that struck the engine in the oil cooler, which would then cause Richthofen in the air to shut the engine off and turn the fuel off, which he did. When they got to the plane, the mags were off and the fuel line was shut off, which would be a very normal procedure for a pilot when his engine's been struck. So, I believe that Richthofen was killed on the ground. Neither the British nor the Germans want this to be the case. The British, because that would not be a very sportsmanlike situation or officer treatment, and the Germans because they wouldn't want their #1 pilot to have been killed on the ground, rather to have been killed in air battle. That's why the only time they ever did an autopsy on a pilot in World War I was Richthofen. When you read the autopsy report, and recognized that that bullet struck his spine, which would basically eliminate his ability to work the rudder, and then come off the spine and blow out his heart through his chest with a pretty massive hole. There's no way he could have survived that to land the airplane. So Richthofen was killed on the ground.
Put that fool back in his airplane. I can't afford to lose another idealistic hero.
Yes. How many gallons we got going?